Is the Trump administration ignoring a court order? Is this the constitutional crisis we've been warned is coming? These are the questions floating around after Kilmar Abrego Garcia, an illegal immigrant, was deported against a court order. So is this simply a mistake, or is Trump testing how far he can push the court? You will not be shocked to hear that the answer to these questions, are more nuanced and complicated than having simple answers. So let me help you make some sense of it a little bit, okay? So let's give some background of the case first. Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a 29-year-old Salvadoran immigrant who was here in the United States illegally for approximately the last 14 years. He lived in Maryland with his U.S. citizen wife and 3 kids. He grew up in El Salvador until he was 13 when his family moved to Guatemala. I think it should be noted why, in my opinion, not because the details matter to the case, but because I think it's worth remembering that, humans are complicated and their stories matter sometimes. So his father was a police officer and his mother ran a family business, and a local gang, Barrio 18, started extorting the family and threatened to kill Kilmar's older brother if the family didn't comply. The family complied, but the threats kept coming. But eventually they sent that older son, Caesar, to the U.S., and you can guess where the gang moved on to. They moved their threats to Kilmar and his younger sisters. And so that's why the family ended up moving to Guatemala, where they continued to be threatened by the gang. So they eventually sent Kilmar to the U.S. to be with his brother, who is now a U.S. citizen, but I don't know exactly when that citizenship status happened. But either way, he was definitely here illegally. And in 2019, a U.S. immigration judge said Abrego Garcia would likely face persecution if he was deported back to El Salvador. This was in an asylum claim that he was making. And so he shielded him in a ruling that said he could not be deported to that specific country, back to El Salvador, because it would potentially put him in danger. And so this in no way created any legal status for him to continue to be in the country. It only prevented the government from deporting him to El Salvador. And, the questions have come up, is Kilmar Abrego Garcia an MS-13 gang member, as the Trump administration is claiming? During that same 2019 period, and take note, 2019, that is when Donald Trump was president, Abrego Garcia was suspected of being an MS-13 gang member and arrested. And Trump has recently designated the MS-13 gang as a terrorist organization, which allows him some different emergency powers that he wouldn't have otherwise, okay? But it should be noted that he has not been charged with any related crimes in the U.S., and it should also be noted that it appears the evidence that he's an MS-13 gang member comes from a confidential informant alone, and there are some discrepancies there. The confidential informant said that he was a member of the gang in New York, but Abrego Garcia has never even been to New York. So there are some discrepancies there that I think are worth looking into, and this is why due process is important. We don't really know if he's an MS-13 gang member or not, but for the sake of this case, it actually doesn't completely matter, because that's actually not one of the details that matters. That's just what the right, media on the right, is claiming, he's an MS-13 gang member and some other things that are bad about him, and so therefore this is okay to get rid of this person. One other thing you'll hear from the right is that in 2021, his wife filed a temporary restraining order on him after an argument in which Kilmar scratched her and tore her shirt off. The case was dropped weeks later, and his wife stated, specifically, and this is her quote, "After surviving domestic violence in a previous relationship, I acted out of caution after a disagreement with Kilmar by seeking a civil protective order in case things escalated," she stated, "but things did not escalate, and I decided not to follow through with the civil court process." So then, just recently, the Trump administration deported Abrego Garcia and other suspected gang members to El Salvador and have an agreement with the government there to detain them in this sort of infamous terrorist prison that they keep him in. It's very overcrowded. But anyway, we're paying like $6 million to house 300 inmates in that prison to El Salvador government. Okay, so that is where we are right now. That has happened. The Trump administration deported this guy, and the courts have gotten involved because of that 2019 ruling that says, hey, you actually could not deport him to El Salvador, and you did. And so therefore, you've got to get him back here. So that brings up the question, was this intentional or was it a mistake? That's kind of the first question here. In the process of the courts getting involved in this, the lawyers for the government admitted that they made a mistake deporting Abrego Garcia to a country that they weren't allowed to. I think it should be noted, just for the sake of it, is that that lawyer who admitted that in court, that yes, we made a mistake, he's been placed on leave. I think that's silly. It's pretty obvious the Trump administration has made a lot of mistakes. Every administration is going to make mistakes, and it should be about fixing them. But if you can't even admit the mistake, it's a little hard to fix it, right? I do personally believe believe that this was likely a mistake and an oversight. I don't think that this was Trump trying to set up a fight with the Supreme Court. Maybe they're taking advantage of the court thing to see if they would win in that fight in this moment, but I don't think it was on purpose. Just look at all the other unforced errors that the Trump administration is making, and I think it's pretty easy to see how this could also be one of those unforced errors. So here's where things start getting a little complicated. A circuit judge told the administration that they needed to facilitate and effectuate his return to the U.S. And to be clear, not because the administration does not have the power to deport him, just they don't have the right to deport him to El Salvador without first arguing in a court that he either doesn't have that protection and it should be lifted, or they want to deport him somewhere else, okay? So they're just trying to get him back here so that he can have that due process. They're not saying the administration can't deport him. The court is essentially saying that Abrego Garcia deserves that due process, right? Which we guarantee for everyone in the U.S. It's not just for U.S. citizens. And you may feel like, and I get this feeling, why should we give gang members or designated terrorists due process? Well, I believe that we need due process to determine that they are, in fact, gang members or terrorists in the first place. We don't just want the executive branch to be able to label anyone a terrorist and then be able to do whatever they want to with them. We need to have the courts involved in this system to make sure and verify. It's not that everything with deportation has to go through a criminal trial. People don't have to be a criminal for the U.S. government to deport them. But we do need to figure out that, like, A, they are an illegal immigrant, because there have been things floating around of potentially them even deporting people who did have protected legal status. There's all sorts of other cases going on. But that notwithstanding, we need that. We need to know that's what due process does. It lets us know that we are making the right choice, and we do have the power to do the thing we're saying we have the power to do. The Trump administration has appealed this up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled 9-0. So yes, a completely unanimous decision that, yeah, the circuit court can ask the executive branch to facilitate his return, although they didn't like the effectuate language, which we'll get into in just one second, but said the court needed to better define what facilitate means. And here's where we get into the lawyery stuff that lawyers get paid an incredible amount of money by the minute to fight about definitions, right? That's what they do, is fight about the very minute difference. And look, I don't get paid by the minute. I only get paid in likes and subscribes. So, do the thing. But I'm going to try to make this quick for that purpose. Trump's people say facilitate means they just have to welcome Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. As if, like, El Salvador sends him back, they'd be like, yeah, we'll let you in. They're claiming that's all they have to do. That's what facilitate means, because facilitate means like make easier, okay? The Trump administration has said that they would provide a plane, but they basically said they don't really have control over this because we don't have him in custody. El Salvador has him in custody, which is a little getting into some semantics. It's like, yeah, we're going to allow this to happen, but we're not going to actively do anything to set those wheels in motion. That's what the Trump administration is claiming facilitate means. That has not made the circuit court specifically happy because they've demanded the government show what steps it has taken to facilitate anything happening so far. And so far, we've not seen the evidence we've not seen that stuff happen yet. So effectuate, the difference between facilitate and effectuate means put into operation. This gets tricky, and this is where Donald Trump's people are starting to say, well, this is a separation to power issue. This is the court telling the executive branch how to do their foreign policy, and the courts can't do that. Because effectuate obviously indicates in this specific example, because there's a foreign government involved, this is potentially the courts telling the government what they can and can't do when it comes to foreign relations. Or keep in mind, we have foreign prisoners in all sorts of countries. And so courts can't necessarily tell the executive branch, hey, you've got to go negotiate with a foreign government. That's just not in the court's power at all. I think it's fairly obvious beyond just the text of the stuff that we could argue about here that the courts, what they want to happen is that they want the Trump administration to fix their mistake. That's it. They don't want to have to get into the weeds of defining facilitate. They'd rather Trump just own the mistake and bring him back. But the administration seems to be digging in their heels, as Homeland Security is claiming the agency does not have the authority to forcibly extract an alien from the domestic custody of a foreign sovereign nation. And that's where we get into this custody dispute. Who has custody of this guy? Is it El Salvador or is it the United States? Even the president of El Salvador is weighing in, saying, the question is preposterous. How can I smuggle a terrorist into the United States? J.D. Vance even chimed in as the administration's sort of official X and Twitter spokesperson. That seems to be all he does all day. Are you proposing that we invade El Salvador to retrieve a gang member with no legal right to be in the country? Where in the Supreme Court's decision does it require us to do that? But come on, guys. When is the last time you heard Donald Trump or anyone around him claim he doesn't have a power? I'm really serious here. This is clearly bad faith. It's so obvious that the U.S. wouldn't need to invade El Salvador in this situation. The Trump administration is framing this as a separations of power argument and pretending they have no control over the prisoner after they've sent him to El Salvador, but that is BS. As National Review's Andy McCarthy points out, significantly, El Salvador's Ministry of Public Affairs asserted in a memorandum about the agreement with our State Department, the Republic of El Salvador confirms it will house these individuals for 1 year pending the United States decision on their long-term disposition. It couldn't be clearer. This is a temporary agreement under which the Trump administration maintains dominion and control over the fate of the prisoners. Under the known terms of the U.S.-El Salvador agreement, there appears to be no reason other than its own stubbornness that the Trump administration cannot obtain Abrego Garcia's immediate transfer to the Salvadorian prison, where he remains constructively in U.S. custody. That makes sense to me. And going back to President Bukele's response, I think it's actually a problem for the Trump administration's case, because if they were really doing their best to, quote, facilitate Abrego Garcia's return, Trump right there in that press conference at the White House could have spoken up and said, oh, you wouldn't have to smuggle him in at all. We're happily facilitating his return. But allowing Bukele to say as much, to me, obviously indicates that the administration is doing nothing to facilitate the return. They would have told him not to say such a thing or pushed back when we know they're okay with pushing back on foreign leaders at White House press conferences from the Zelensky blowup that we just saw recently. I just don't believe for a second that the president of El Salvador, who just got a gigantic contract from the government to detain deported immigrants, isn't going to do exactly what Trump asked him to do. Again, when's the last time you heard Donald Trump say he didn't have power over someone? Could this turn into a separations of power argument? Sure, I just don't think we're there yet. So far, the Supreme Court has simply asked the lower court to better define facilitate. We'll have to see what they say facilitate means to see if the Supreme Court says that, yes, you can or can't do that. If you want to get into the legal weeds about the theories of what courts could and couldn't order the executive branch to do, I'd suggest watching this Advisory Opinions podcast on the subject. David French and Sarah Isger get into the lawyer nerd weeds about all the scenarios, and it's quite fascinating, but I will spare you that here. Okay, so what questions are remaining? We've established that no one is saying the administration can't deport this guy, just not to El Salvador, but some of those executive powers come specifically from designating MS-13 as a terrorist organization, and I worry about that a little bit, because what's to stop the next Democrat president from declaring some subset of American citizens as much? Remember how the FBI was investigating angry parents at school board meetings? Or you might not even have to wait, because Trump literally said, the homegrowns are next. The homegrowns. You've got to build about 5 more places, referring to sending U.S. citizens to El Salvador prisons. I would love to hear MAGA's defense of that statement. So Trump is claiming this is a separation of powers argument and may have some legitimacy there, but I think that's skipping some steps to get there. I think that's why the Supreme Court told the lower court to better define facilitate so that they could rule on appeal if that lower court indeed has the power over the executive branch. At the same time, I think it's obvious the claims that the government no longer has control over the fate of these prisoners. I think that's ridiculous. But has Trump defied a court order? No, I don't think he has yet. But maybe that is where we're headed, because it's obvious the Trump administration has no intention right now of doing anything to get Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. Is that because he's an unsympathetic figure, a potential gang member, an illegal immigrant? Probably, yeah. I don't think this was their intention all along, but now that they have this opportunity, maybe it's worth seeing what happens if they defy a court order or two that possibly allows them to hide behind a separations of power argument. I think they want to have that fight eventually, because Trump does want to consolidate power into the executive branch. In the end, though, this entire thing is not about that immigration or the deportation. You can truly be on either side of that argument, really. I think it's just about due process and whether Abrego Garcia is technically still in the executive branch's custody. We've yet to see if it will escalate to the true separations of power disagreement or a constitutional crisis. So I would ignore the headlines that claim we're in one of those things, but stay tuned. And the best way to do that, if you like principled conservative political content, is to like and subscribe, obviously. And while normally I'd ask you to watch some other video of mine at this point, I think you should watch this new OK Go video instead, because these guys just knock it out of the park every time.